Terrell I. O'Connell walked into the federal immigration courtroom in silence, his mahogany walking stick announcing each deliberate step with a hollow click against marble floors. To the aggressive ICE agent standing opposite him, O'Connell appeared to be just another disabled veteran who could be intimidated into compliance. That assumption was a career-ending catastrophe. The agent judged the knee brace and the graying beard, failing to realize he was antagonizing a retired Marine general with a command presence usually reserved for war rooms and battlefield decisions. What followed wasn't just a confrontation. It was a masterclass in how arrogance meets elite discipline and loses spectacularly. When the officer reached for the walking stick, he didn't expect the storm of federal consequences about to rain down on his corrupt career. This is the story of how a power-tripping bureaucrat learned the hardest lesson of his life. The air in the specialized immigration hearing room of the federal building was oppressive, not from heat, but from the weight of broken families and bureaucratic indifference. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the sickly yellow glow that only government buildings seem to perfect. Seated in hard plastic chairs along the back wall were a dozen people clutching manila folders and wrinkled documents, their faces etched with the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting systems designed to exhaust you. Standing near the front, away from the other petitioners, was a man who carried himself differently. Terrell I. O'Connell was 6 feet 3 inches, with shoulders that strained against a well-tailored charcoal suit. The kind of suit that whispered money and respect, not the off-the-rack desperation most people wore to these hearings. His beard was salt and pepper, trimmed with military precision, and his dark skin showed the kind of weathering that comes from years spent in harsh climates doing harder work. But it was the walking stick that drew the eye first. A beautifully crafted mahogany cane with a brass handle, supporting his right side, as his left leg bore the visible bulk of a heavy-duty knee brace beneath his pressed slacks. To the casual observer, Terrell looked like a retired professional, perhaps a lawyer or businessman, dealing with some unfortunate family matter. Someone dignified but diminished. Someone who had seen better days. That was by design. Terrell didn't wear his Marine Corps ring, the one with the eagle, globe, and anchor that had marked 30 years of service. He didn't carry the leather-bound credential case that identified him as a former 2-star general, the kind of case that opened doors and straightened spines when flashed in official settings. He didn't wear the Omega Seamaster his battalion had gifted him after his last deployment, the watch face engraved with coordinates from Helmand Province. Today, he was just a son trying to help his elderly mother navigate a system that seemed designed to swallow people whole. He preferred it that way. The uniform was retired. The rank was retired. He was just Terrell now. He didn't fidget. He didn't check his phone. He just waited, his eyes making slow, methodical sweeps of the room, cataloging exits, noting the positions of the 2 armed security officers, observing the judge's elevated bench and the federal seal mounted on the wood-paneled wall behind it. It was automatic, this threat assessment, the muscle memory of someone who had spent decades evaluating tactical situations. "O'Connell!" The voice cut through the murmuring anxiety of the waiting room like a knife. Terrell turned slowly, the walking stick pivoting with him in a practiced motion. The voice belonged to Agent Curtis L. McDaniels, a man whose ICE uniform strained across a belly that suggested too many hours behind a desk and too many lunches that ran long. McDaniels was red-faced, even in the cool air, his thinning hair slicked back with too much gel, and he carried his badge clipped to his belt like a trophy. He had the particular swagger of a man who had spent years wielding small powers over vulnerable people. McDaniels stopped 5 feet away, hooking his thumbs into his belt. His eyes flicked dismissively over Terrell, taking in the cane, the brace, the graying beard, and something like satisfaction flickered across his features. A target. An easy one. "You O'Connell? Terrell I. O'Connell?" McDaniels repeated, pronouncing the name with exaggerated slowness, as if speaking to someone hard of hearing or simple. "That's correct," Terrell replied, his voice even and controlled. The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to command attention. The kind of voice that had once ordered artillery strikes and coordinated multi-battalion operations. McDaniel smirked, a wet, unpleasant expression. "Well, Mr. O'Connell, I hope you brought your checkbook because your mother's been breaking federal law, and there are going to be consequences. Big ones." Terrell didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, weight distributed carefully between his good leg and the cane, his dark eyes fixed on the agent with an unsettling stillness. The kind of stillness that predators have before they move. He didn't shift. He didn't blink. He just waited. To the trained observer, someone who had served, someone who understood the language of military bearing, the way Terrell held himself would have been a 5-alarm warning. His posture was too perfect, his balance too calculated, his scan of the room too tactical. Every few seconds, his eyes would flicker to the exits, to the positions of the security officers, to the judge's bench. It was the automatic threat assessment of someone who had commanded thousands in combat zones. Someone who had called in airstrikes and coordinated battalion movements under fire. But McDaniels saw none of that. He saw a broken old man with a limp. A man whose best days were behind him. Someone who could be pushed. "You hearing me, buddy?" McDaniels stepped closer, invading Terrell's personal space, his voice rising. "Your mother's residency documentation has more holes than Swiss cheese. She's been here illegally for months, maybe years. We're talking detention, deportation proceedings, and if you think your fancy suit is going to—" "Agent McDaniels," Terrell interrupted quietly, each word measured and precise. "My mother is a legal permanent resident with a valid green card. Her paperwork is current and has been filed appropriately with USCIS. If there's been a clerical error, I'm confident we can resolve it today without escalation." The words were diplomatic, professional, the kind of de-escalation that someone trained in conflict resolution would use. But there was something underneath them, a core of absolute certainty, an unshakable confidence that came from having faced down warlords and insurgents and corrupt officials in places where the rule of law was enforced by the barrel of a gun. McDaniel's face darkened, blood rushing to his cheeks. He wasn't used to being interrupted, especially not by someone he'd already categorized as beneath him. The people who came through this office were supposed to be scared. They were supposed to stammer and plead and offer bribes. They weren't supposed to speak to him in calm, measured tones that suggested he was the one out of his depth. "You calling me a liar? Is that what you're doing right now?" McDaniels jabbed a finger toward Terrell's chest, stopping just short of contact. "Because I've got the authority here, old man. I decide what happens to your mother. I decide whether she stays or goes. You understand that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The other people in the waiting area had gone quiet, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Even the clerk behind the bulletproof glass had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. Everyone could feel it, the shift in atmosphere, the gathering storm. Terrell tilted his head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to be both respectful and utterly condescending. It was the look a general might give a lieutenant who had just made a tactically idiotic suggestion in front of the entire command staff. "I'm saying there may be a misunderstanding that we can clarify with the documentation," Terrell repeated, his tone unchanged. "Would you like to review the paperwork before we proceed?" "The only misunderstanding," McDaniels hissed, stepping even closer, close enough that Terrell could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath, "is you thinking you can walk in here with your fancy suit and your walking stick and talk down to a federal officer. In this room, I have the authority. You understand that? I have the authority." Terrell didn't step back. He didn't need to. His weight remained perfectly distributed, his breathing even and controlled. His hand rested lightly on the brass handle of the walking stick, fingers relaxed but ready. "I understand authority perfectly, Agent McDaniels," he said softly, each word precisely enunciated. "I've exercised it. I've earned it. And I've learned when it's being abused." The courtroom air, usually stale and indifferent, suddenly crackled with a tension that only occurs when a bully realizes, too late, that his chosen target isn't prey at all. It's a predator that's been holding back. And McDaniels, sweating now despite the air conditioning, had just forced that predator to decide whether silence was still an option. 3 weeks earlier, Gladys O'Connell had been driving home from the community center where she volunteered twice a week, teaching English to recent immigrants. At 72, she was a small woman with the kind of dignified bearing that came from having raised 3 children as a single mother while working 2 jobs. Her hands, spotted with age and marked by decades of manual labor, gripped the steering wheel of her 12-year-old Honda Civic at precisely 10 and 2. She had seen the checkpoint from half a mile away. The portable barriers, the flashing lights, the cluster of ICE vehicles creating an improvised inspection zone in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Her heart had sunk, but she'd maintained her speed, signaling properly, following the hand gestures of the officers directing traffic. Agent McDaniels had been the one to approach her window. "License and proof of residency?" he'd barked, not bothering with pleasantries or even basic respect. His eyes had already made their judgment. Elderly black woman, old car, modest clothes. Probably undocumented. Probably scared. Probably easy. Gladys had handed over her driver's license and green card with steady hands, even though her pulse was racing. She'd been a permanent resident for 43 years, since emigrating from Jamaica in 1982. Her papers were in order. They'd always been in order. McDaniels had taken the documents, held them up to the light, squinted at them with exaggerated suspicion. "When did you enter the country, ma'am?" "1982, sir, as it states on my green card." "Uh-huh." He'd flipped the card over, running his thumb across the raised seal. "And you've maintained continuous residency since then?" "Yes, sir. I have all my documentation." "Step out of the vehicle, please." The request had been delivered in a tone that made it clear it wasn't a request at all. Gladys had complied, her arthritis making the movement awkward and slow. McDaniels had stood too close, invading her space, using his bulk to intimidate. Behind him, 2 other agents had approached, hands resting casually on their service weapons. "This card looks fake to me," McDaniels had announced, loud enough for the other drivers to hear. "The hologram's off. The weight's wrong. I think we've got ourselves a fraudulent document here." Gladys's stomach had dropped. "Sir, that card is legitimate. I can show you." "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to place your hands on the hood of the vehicle." "Sir, Hands on the hood, now." What followed had been a masterclass in bureaucratic harassment. McDaniels had detained her for 3 hours, running her information through multiple databases, calling supervisors who never seemed to be available, suggesting that she could make all of this go away if she just signed a voluntary departure form. The other agents had searched her car with a thoroughness that bordered on vandalism, emptying her glove compartment, pulling the seats forward, questioning every receipt and document they found. The whole time, McDaniels had kept up a running commentary designed to erode her confidence. "You know how much prison time there is for document fraud? 5 years minimum. And at your age, that's basically a life sentence. But if you cooperate, if you just sign here and agree to self-deport, we can make this all go away. No charges, no trial, just a voluntary exit. Think about your family. You want to put them through a trial?" Gladys had refused to sign anything. She'd asked for a lawyer. She'd asked to call her son. Both requests had been ignored. Finally, after running her information through every database available and finding absolutely nothing wrong with her documentation, McDaniels had been forced to admit there was no basis for detention. But he'd done it with maximum humiliation, handing back her green card like it was contaminated, making a show of warning her that she'd be watched closely going forward, suggesting that any minor infraction would result in immediate deportation proceedings. "You got lucky today, Grandma," he'd said, leaning into her car window as she'd sat back in the driver's seat, hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "But I've got my eye on you. One mistake, one missed renewal, one parking ticket you don't pay, and I will personally make sure you're on the first flight back to whatever island you crawled off of. You understand me?" Gladys had nodded, too shaken to speak, and driven away. She hadn't told Terrell about the incident, not at first. She knew her son, knew the controlled fury that lived beneath his calm exterior, the sense of justice that had driven him to serve for 30 years, the protective instinct that made him dangerous when people he loved were threatened. She'd tried to handle it herself, contacting an immigration attorney, filing a formal complaint through proper channels. But McDaniels hadn't been finished with her. 2 weeks after the checkpoint incident, she'd received a certified letter from ICE. The language had been dense and bureaucratic, but the message was clear. Her green card status was under review. There were irregularities in her documentation. She was required to appear at a hearing within 30 days or face immediate deportation proceedings. That's when she'd finally called Terrell. He'd listened in silence as she'd explained the checkpoint, the detention, the threats, the letter. When she'd finished, there had been a long pause on the line. When he'd finally spoken, his voice had been very quiet. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll handle it." And he had. Within 48 hours, he'd retained one of the best immigration attorneys in the state, pulled every document related to his mother's residency status, and filed a counterbrief challenging the basis for the review. He'd been methodical, professional, working through proper channels. But he'd also made sure he would be present at the hearing, because he wanted to look the man who had terrorized his mother in the eyes. He wanted to see what kind of person used federal authority to prey on elderly women. And he wanted to make sure it never happened again. All rise, the Honorable Dominique C. Trudeau presiding. The courtroom shuffled to its feet with the collective sigh of people who had been waiting too long in uncomfortable chairs. Judge Trudeau entered from her chambers, a black woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She carried herself with the particular authority of someone who had spent 20 years on the federal bench and had long ago stopped being impressed by grandstanding attorneys or bureaucratic overreach. She settled into her seat, surveyed the courtroom with a kind of look that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book and invented a few of her own, and adjusted her glasses. Case number 2025-IMM-7834. O'Connell Residency Review. Counsel, please state your appearances for the record. Patricia Lawson, for the petitioner, Your Honor. Terrell's attorney stood, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s, with the kind of precisely tailored suit that suggested she billed at $500 an hour and was worth every penny. She had the slightly predatory look of someone who enjoyed eviscerating weak legal arguments. Agent Curtis McDaniels, representing ICE, Your Honor. McDaniels had stood as well, tugging at his uniform jacket as if it had suddenly gotten tighter. He didn't have an attorney. This was supposed to be a routine administrative hearing, the kind of thing where the government agent showed up, presented their findings, and the immigrant either capitulated or got deported. Simple, clean, the way it always worked. Except Gladys O'Connell had shown up with a lawyer who looked like she ate ICE agents for breakfast. Judge Trudeau made a note, then looked up. Agent McDaniels, this is your petition. Please state the basis for this residency review. McDaniels cleared his throat, consulted a folder that looked suspiciously thin, and launched into his presentation. Your Honor, the respondent, Gladys O'Connell, is a 72-year-old Jamaican national who claims to have maintained continuous legal permanent residency since 1982. However, during a routine checkpoint inspection 3 weeks ago, irregularities were discovered in her documentation that call into question the validity of her status. What irregularities? Judge Trudeau's tone was neutral, but there was something sharp underneath it. The holographic security features on her green card appeared inconsistent with authentic documents from that era. Additionally, the respondent was unable to provide comprehensive documentation of her continuous residency. Unable or not asked? Attorney Lawson interjected smoothly. McDaniels shot her a look. She was detained for 3 hours. She had ample opportunity. Did you ask her specifically for documentation beyond her green card and driver's license? Lawson pressed. The nature of the stop didn't require. Judge Trudeau raised a hand. Counsel, you'll have your opportunity. Agent McDaniels, continue. McDaniels straightened, trying to regain his momentum. Furthermore, the respondent has a documented history of immigration violations. I'm sorry, what? Attorney Lawson was on her feet. Your Honor, this is the first we're hearing of any alleged violations. Discovery materials contained no such references. Judge Trudeau's expression had gone very still. Agent McDaniels, what violations are you referring to? McDaniels flipped through his folder with increasing desperation. Terrell, watching from the gallery next to his mother, saw the moment the agent realized he'd made a critical error. McDaniels had been bluffing, throwing accusations at the wall to see what stuck, assuming nobody would actually challenge him on specifics. The violations are referenced in our internal database, Your Honor. I don't have the specific documentation with me at this moment, but you don't have documentation of violations you're citing as basis for this hearing? Judge Trudeau's voice had dropped about 10 degrees. Agent McDaniels, are you telling this court you initiated formal review proceedings based on database entries you can't substantiate? Your Honor, the database is maintained by, I'll take that as a yes. Judge Trudeau made a note that looked like it might be career-ending. Let's move on. You mentioned irregularities in the green card. Did you submit it for forensic analysis? That wasn't deemed necessary at the time. So your allegation of document fraud is based on your visual inspection at a roadside checkpoint? Your Honor, I've been doing this for 15 years. I know what a fake card looks like. 15 years of what? Exactly? Attorney Lawson was back on her feet, and now she looked genuinely angry. Your Honor, if I may approach? Judge Trudeau nodded, and Lawson approached the bench with a document. Your Honor, we ran Agent McDaniels' own credentials. His training certifications in document authentication expired in 2019 and were never renewed. He is not, in fact, qualified to make forensic determinations about document authenticity. Additionally, she handed up another paper. Mrs. O'Connell's green card was issued in 1982, before holographic security features were standard. The irregularities Agent McDaniels observed are actually consistent with authentic documents from that era. The judge accepted the documents, read them with the kind of careful attention that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day, and looked up at McDaniels over her glasses. Agent McDaniels, do you have anything else? McDaniels was sweating now, his face flushed. He could feel it slipping away, the easy intimidation, the bureaucratic power play, the assumption that nobody would actually fight back. His eyes scanned the courtroom as if looking for an escape route. And that's when he saw Terrell, the man with the walking stick, the disabled veteran who had dared to speak to him with that calm, superior tone in the hallway. McDaniels felt a surge of frustrated rage. This was his fault somehow. If the son hadn't hired some expensive lawyer, if he'd just let his mother sign the voluntary departure like any sensible person would have done, none of this would be happening. Your Honor, McDaniels said, his voice rising with desperation, I'd like to note for the record that the respondent's family has been deliberately obstructive throughout this process. Her son, he pointed at Terrell, has been hostile and threatening from the outset. Just this morning before the hearing, he implied, Agent McDaniels? Judge Trudeau's voice cracked like a whip. You're under oath. Are you seriously claiming that a family member's decision to retain counsel and challenge your findings constitutes obstruction? He was disrespectful, Your Honor. He refused to acknowledge my authority. Your authority to do what, exactly? To make unfounded allegations? To initiate proceedings based on expired certifications and visual hunches? Judge Trudeau closed the folder in front of her with a sharp snap. Agent McDaniels, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I strongly suggest you think very carefully before answering. Did you have any legitimate, documented reason to believe Mrs. O'Connell's immigration status was in violation of federal law? The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys. McDaniels opened his mouth, closed it. His training, what little he remembered of it, was screaming at him to back down, to admit the hearing was premature, to ask for a continuance to gather actual evidence. But his pride, wounded and raw, wouldn't let him. Your Honor, the fact remains that this woman was detained at a lawful checkpoint and her documentation raised questions. If she has nothing to hide, that's not an answer to my question. Then she should be willing to undergo additional screening. The fact that her son is so aggressively fighting this suggests there's something they don't want us to find. And honestly, Your Honor, his voice took on a note of desperation. The way he's been acting, the disrespect, the implications, I wouldn't be surprised if there's more going on here than just a simple residency question. He was flailing now, throwing anything out there to deflect from his complete lack of evidence. And in doing so, he'd just made a terminal mistake. Judge Trudeau set down her pen with deliberate care. Agent McDaniels, are you suggesting that exercising constitutional rights to legal representation is evidence of criminal activity? I'm suggesting that legitimate residents don't usually need high-priced lawyers to prove. They do when facing baseless government harassment. Attorney Lawson's voice was ice cold. Your Honor, I move for immediate dismissal of these proceedings with prejudice and formal sanction against Agent McDaniels for abuse of process. And that's when Curtis McDaniels, federal agent with 15 years of experience terrorizing people who couldn't fight back, made the worst decision of his professional life. His eyes locked on Terrell O'Connell, sitting calmly in the gallery with his walking stick, and something snapped. Chapter 4. The Grab for the Cane. The thing about tactical training is that it never really leaves you. Terrell saw McDaniels move before the agent had fully committed to the action. Saw the shift in weight, the bunching of shoulder muscles, the telltale lean that preceded aggressive movement. 30 years of combat experience had programmed his nervous system to recognize threats before his conscious mind could process them. The walking stick was suddenly a weapon in his hand. Not because he decided to make it one, but because his muscle memory had already calculated vectors, balance points, and defensive responses. McDaniels had lurched from behind the respondent's table, his face purple with rage and humiliation. "You!" he shouted, jabbing a finger toward Terrell. "This is all because of you and your—" "Agent McDaniels!" Judge Trudeau was on her feet. "Sit down immediately." But McDaniels was past hearing, past thinking. He'd been humiliated in front of a federal judge, exposed as incompetent and dishonest, and his reptile brain had fixed on the one person he could still hurt, the disabled man with the walking stick, the one who'd spoken to him with that calm, superior tone, the one who represented everything that was wrong with this situation. He crossed the space between the table and the gallery in 3 strides. His hand reached for the mahogany walking stick, fingers closing around the brass handle in a grip meant to wrench it away. The plan, if it could be called that, was to destabilize the man, maybe push him back into his seat, assert some physical dominance to make up for the professional humiliation. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Terrell's right hand released the cane handle just as McDaniels grabbed it, causing the agent to pull against zero resistance. McDaniels stumbled forward, off balance. In that same fluid motion, Terrell's left hand moved, not fast, not flashy, but with the absolute precision of someone who had trained 10,000 hours in close-quarters combat. His palm caught McDaniel's extended wrist, controlling the joint. His right hand, now free, moved to McDaniel's elbow. It was a textbook joint lock, the kind taught in every military hand-to-hand combat course. Wrist control plus elbow pressure equals complete control of another person's body. Terrell applied it with surgical precision, enough force to stop the aggression, not enough to cause injury. McDaniels froze, his face suddenly registering pain and confusion. Terrell pivoted, using McDaniel's own momentum to guide him in a controlled arc. The agent's feet scrambled for purchase as he was smoothly redirected away from Terrell and toward the courtroom's side wall. It looked almost balletic, a clean, professional defensive movement that left McDaniel's face first against the wood paneling. His arm gently, but firmly, extended behind him at an angle that made further resistance extremely painful. The entire courtroom erupted. "Security!" Judge Trudeau's voice thundered through the chamber. The two court security officers converged on the scene, hands on their weapons, trying to assess a situation that had gone from quiet hearing to physical confrontation in seconds. What they saw stopped them cold. A disabled man in expensive suit, standing perfectly balanced despite his knee brace, controlling a federal agent twice his size with one hand while retrieving his walking stick with the other. "Sir, release him," the lead security officer commanded, weapon still holstered but hand ready. Terrell complied immediately, stepping back with his hands visible, the walking stick held loosely in his right hand. He moved with the same calm precision he'd shown throughout the entire encounter. No aggression, no triumph, just controlled professionalism. McDaniels pushed off the wall, whirling to face Terrell, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. "He assaulted me. Did you see that? He assaulted a federal officer. I want him arrested. I want him—" "Agent McDaniels." Judge Trudeau's voice could have cut steel. "You will be silent. You will sit down. Or I will have you removed from my courtroom in handcuffs. Do you understand me?" McDaniels opened his mouth, looked at the judge's face, and thought better of it. He returned to his seat, shaking with rage and adrenaline. Judge Trudeau turned her attention to Terrell, who had settled back into his seat next to his mother, the walking stick once again resting against his leg. His breathing was completely steady. His hands weren't shaking. He looked like a man who had just sat down after retrieving something from a high shelf, not someone who had just been physically attacked. "Sir," Judge Trudeau said, her voice carefully controlled, "are you injured?" "No, Your Honor." "Do you wish to press charges?" Terrell considered this. Attorney Lawson, who had watched the entire exchange with the kind of predatory interest that criminal defense attorneys get when they witness slam-dunk assault cases, was nodding vigorously. But Terrell had a different calculation running through his mind. Pressing charges meant a long legal battle, media attention, his military record being dragged through discovery. It meant time and energy that could be better spent on other things. It meant keeping his mother in the spotlight she'd never wanted. On the other hand, it meant ensuring McDaniels never did this to another family. "Your Honor," Terrell said quietly, "I'd prefer to defer that decision until I've had time to consult with counsel." Judge Trudeau nodded slowly. "Understood. The court notes for the record that Agent McDaniels initiated physical contact with a member of the gallery without provocation. The security footage will be preserved." She fixed McDaniels with a look that could have frozen nitrogen. "Agent, you are fortunate that the gentleman you attacked showed considerably more restraint than you did. You are also fortunate that you are not currently in handcuffs." She turned to Attorney Lawson. "Counsel, you had a motion?" Lawson stood, straightening papers that didn't need straightening, clearly trying to suppress a smile. "Yes, Your Honor. Motion to dismiss with prejudice and for sanctions." "Granted. These proceedings are dismissed. Mrs. O'Connell's residency status is and remains valid. Agent McDaniels, I am formally referring this matter to the Office of Professional Responsibility at Immigration and Customs Enforcement, along with my recommendation that you be placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. I am also referring today's conduct to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution. McDaniels was white now, all the blood drained from his face. Your Honor, You are dismissed, Agent McDaniels. I suggest you contact your union representative immediately. Judge Trudeau gathered her papers, stood, and left the bench. The courtroom began to empty in a subdued murmur of shocked conversation. Gladys O'Connell, who had watched her son defend himself with the kind of controlled violence that reminded her exactly why the Marine Corps had made him a general, reached over and squeezed his hand. "That was your one-handed control and pivot, wasn't it?" she said quietly. "The one you used to practice in the backyard when you came home from officer training." Terrell smiled slightly. "Some things you never forget, Mom." But Curtis McDaniels wasn't finished. As he gathered his files with shaking hands, he made one last desperate calculation. This wasn't over. It couldn't be over. There had to be a way to salvage this, to turn it around, to make someone, anyone, pay for the humiliation he'd just endured. And as he left the courtroom, his mind was already working on how to spin this story, how to make himself the victim, how to ensure that Terrell O'Connell regretted the day he dared to stand up to a federal agent. He had no idea that the storm had only just begun. The hallway outside the courtroom had the kind of institutional silence that follows significant events. Terrell stood with his mother and Attorney Lawson near the elevator bank, discussing next steps in voices that carried the relief of a crisis averted. "The judge was right to preserve the security footage," Lawson was saying, scrolling through notes on her tablet. "If you decide to pursue charges, and I strongly recommend you do, that video will make it an open and shut case. Assault on a civilian in a federal courthouse is not something they take lightly." Terrell nodded slowly, but his attention wasn't fully on the conversation. Years of tactical awareness meant he was always monitoring his surroundings, and something had caught his eye down the hallway. McDaniels hadn't left the building. Instead, he was huddled in an alcove near the restrooms, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing with his free hand in a way that suggested agitation. "Recommend you speak with a civil rights attorney as well," Lawson was continuing. "Pattern and practice case against ICE, violation of your mother's civil rights, emotional distress. We're talking a substantial settlement." "Patricia," Gladys interrupted gently, "I just want this to be over. No more hearings, no more stress. Can we please just go home?" Lawson softened immediately. "Of course, Mrs. O'Connell. I'll handle the formal paperwork and make sure everything's properly documented. You should receive confirmation of the dismissal within a week. And Terrell," she turned to him, "call me when you've decided about the charges. Don't wait too long. There are statutes of limitation." They shook hands. Lawson departed toward the attorney elevators, and Terrell was guiding his mother toward the public exit when he heard raised voices behind them. "Don't care what the judge said. He assaulted me. I want him detained for questioning." Terrell turned. McDaniels had re-emerged from his phone call, and he'd apparently summoned reinforcements. 2 additional ICE agents had arrived, younger men with the eager look of officers who still thought the badge made them invincible. They were flanking McDaniels as he pointed dramatically at Terrell. One of the courtroom security officers, a heavyset man named Ramirez, who had worked federal security for 20 years, positioned himself between the ICE agents and Terrell's group. "Agent McDaniels, you need to leave the building. Judge's orders." "That man," McDaniels' voice was shrill now, losing all professional veneer, "attacked me in a federal courthouse. I'm within my rights to detain him for questioning." "You grabbed his walking stick," Ramirez said flatly. "I saw the whole thing. You initiated contact. Now leave before I have you escorted out." One of the younger ICE agents stepped forward, hand moving toward his sidearm in a gesture that was probably meant to be intimidating. "Sir, we're federal officers. We don't take orders from courthouse security." The atmosphere in the hallway changed instantly. Other people waiting for elevators began backing away. Ramirez's partner, a younger woman named Chen, keyed her radio. Terrell felt his mother's hand tighten on his arm. This was escalating in exactly the way he'd hoped to avoid. Law enforcement egos clashing, jurisdictions being invoked, the kind of situation that could turn violent very quickly. He could see the calculations being made, the young ICE agent's hand still hovering near his weapon, McDaniels egging them on with wild accusations. He made a decision. "Gentlemen," Terrell said quietly, his voice cutting through the rising tension like a knife, "may I suggest we all take a breath before this situation becomes something nobody wants it to be?" McDaniels wheeled on him. "You don't get to—" "I have identification that might clarify things," Terrell continued, reaching slowly into his inner jacket pocket. Everyone tensed, hands moving to weapons, until he produced a slim leather wallet. He opened it carefully, revealing not a driver's license, but a military ID card in a special holder. "Retired Major General Terrell Isaiah O'Connell, United States Marine Corps," he said quietly, extending the ID for Ramirez to see. "Service number 2847391644428. 30 years active duty, retired with honors in 2022. The effect was immediate and total. Ramirez, ex-Army himself, snapped to attention reflexively. "Sir, Sir!" He took the ID with something approaching reverence, examined the holographic security features, the special designation that marked general officer credentials, the photo that showed Terrell in dress blues with 2 stars on his collar. The younger ICE agents looked confused, their aggressive posturing deflating like punctured balloons. One of them, the one who'd been reaching for his weapon, went pale. "A general," Ramirez repeated, his voice carrying down the hallway. "You grabbed a Marine Corps general's walking stick." McDaniels had gone from red to white to a sickly gray color. His mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. The full weight of what he'd done was crashing down on him with the force of an avalanche. He hadn't just harassed some random old lady and her disabled son. He'd targeted the mother of a man who had commanded thousands of Marines in combat zones, who had briefed presidents and senators, who had the kind of professional connections that could make phone calls to people who could end careers with a word. The younger ICE agents were backing away now, distancing themselves physically and professionally from McDaniels with the instinct of sailors leaving a sinking ship. "General," Ramirez said, handing back the ID with both hands in a gesture of respect. "I apologize for this disruption. If there's anything—" "Thank you, but that won't be necessary," Terrell replied, pocketing the ID. "I'd just like to take my mother home. It's been a long day." He turned toward the elevator, his mother on his arm, the walking stick clicking its measured rhythm against the marble floor. But then he paused, looked back at McDaniels, and spoke with the voice of someone who had once ordered artillery strikes and coordinated battalion movements. "Agent McDaniels, I'd suggest you speak with your union representative as soon as possible, and perhaps consider why you felt the need to terrorize a 72-year-old woman over paperwork you never actually verified. Character is revealed in how we treat people who can't fight back. You might want to think about what today revealed about yours." The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Terrell and his mother stepped inside. The doors began to close, and the last thing McDaniels saw was the retired general's calm, steady gaze. The look of a man who had fought wars, lost Marines under his command, and learned that real strength was measured in restraint, not aggression. The doors closed. Curtis McDaniels stood in the hallway, surrounded by colleagues who were already pretending they didn't know him, and felt the full weight of his catastrophic mistake settle onto his shoulders like a lead blanket. His phone buzzed. A text from his supervisor. "My office, now." His career was over. He knew it with the same certainty that doomed men feel when the walls finally close in. But the worst part, the part that would keep him awake at night for years, was that he'd brought it entirely on himself. Curtis McDaniels sat in the cramped ICE conference room watching his career disintegrate. His union representative, Gary Plemons, kept glancing at his watch as if he had somewhere better to be. The email from the U.S. Attorney's Office glowed on McDaniels' phone. Notice of federal investigation. Case number 2025-CR-8847. The door opened without a knock. The man who entered was tall and lean, with military bearing evident before you noticed the Navy JAG Corps insignia on his briefcase. Gentlemen, I'm Commander Thomas C. Moffett, Judge Advocate General's Corps, currently on special assignment with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Agent McDaniels, as of this morning, you are the subject of a federal grand jury investigation. Plemons shot to his feet. My client hasn't been... Your client, Moffett interrupted smoothly, sliding a document across the table, assaulted a retired Marine Corps general in a federal courthouse after initiating baseless deportation proceedings against the general's mother. The grand jury issued this subpoena this morning. Personnel files, case records, communications, financial disclosures, everything. McDaniels found his voice. The general didn't press charges. General O'Connell declined to make an immediate decision, Moffett corrected. When I spoke with him this morning, he was quite cooperative. He called the Civil Rights Division not about his own treatment, but on behalf of his mother and any other elderly immigrants similarly harassed by agents who mistake cruelty for competence. McDaniels felt something cold spreading through his chest. The Civil Rights Division has been monitoring checkpoint operations in this district for 18 months. Moffett continued conversationally. We've been interested in unusually high rates of resolved detentions, cases where immigrants are detained for hours, threatened with deportation, then released without charges after signing waivers and paying fines. We've subpoenaed your case files for the past 3 years, your communications, your financial disclosures. We've also frozen your bank accounts. The room went silent. The voluntary departures, the fines, the cash payments. He'd been so careful. Intermediaries, cash only, offshore accounts. We found the accounts in the Caymans, Moffett said gently. We found the shell companies. Agent McDaniels, you've been running an extortion ring for at least 2 years. You've been using federal authority to terrorize vulnerable people into paying you thousands to avoid deportation proceedings you never had legitimate cause to initiate. Plemons was pacing. Curtis, don't say anything. Commander, this meeting is over. The grand jury reconvenes in 2 weeks, Moffett said, gathering his documents. We have 17 victims willing to testify, financial records showing over $200,000 in unexplained deposits, and security footage of you assaulting a 2-star general. Agent McDaniels, I strongly suggest you retain criminal counsel. What you need now is someone who specializes in defending federal corruption cases. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, you could have avoided all of this. If you'd just done your job with integrity, treated people with basic human dignity, you'd still have a career. Instead, you're going to explain to a jury why you thought terrorizing a 72-year-old woman was an appropriate exercise of federal authority. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot. McDaniels' phone buzzed. Email from his supervisor. Immediate administrative leave. Security clearance suspended. Turn in your badge and weapon. Somewhere in the building, Commander Moffett was already moving to his next meeting, building this case piece by piece, until the evidence was so overwhelming no defense could crack it. And Curtis McDaniels, who'd spent 15 years wielding power over people who couldn't fight back, was about to discover what it felt like to face the full weight of federal justice with nowhere to hide. Investigator Martina J. Coakley had been with the DHS Office of Inspector General for 19 years, developing a reputation for following paper trails that drove criminals insane. She had methodical patience, the willingness to spend 6 months cross-referencing bank statements, building spreadsheets connecting distant dots, reconstructing criminal enterprises from fragments. The McDaniels case started 18 months ago with a complaint that seemed too minor to pursue. Rosa Delgado claimed an ICE agent demanded $5,000 to resolve irregularities in her work visa. The complaint was filed, then quietly buried as insufficient evidence. But Martina noticed something during a routine audit. The agent was Curtis McDaniels. The checkpoint was Route 37, near a high immigrant neighborhood. The alleged irregularities were never documented, and Rosa withdrew her complaint 3 weeks later, citing personal reasons, in handwriting that looked composed under duress. Martina pulled McDaniels' personnel file. 15 years with ICE, mostly unremarkable. But scattered throughout his checkpoint reports were resolved detentions, immigrants held for questioning, documents flagged as potentially fraudulent, then released after signing voluntary departure agreements or paying administrative fines. The fines were interesting. ICE didn't actually have authority to levy fines for documentation violations. But McDaniels' reports consistently mentioned administrative penalties paid to Immigration Documentation Services, which sounded official, but wasn't affiliated with any government agency. Martina spent 3 months tracking immigration documentation services through shell companies in Delaware, Nevada, and the Cayman Islands. She filed subpoenas in 3 jurisdictions, coordinated with the IRS and Treasury's Financial Crimes Unit, traced wire transfers until they landed in accounts controlled by Curtis L. McDaniels. The amounts were staggering. Over $200,000 from people terrified into paying him to make problems disappear. Problems he'd invented. But the money was only half the story. Martina tracked down victims. Difficult work since many had left the country or were too scared to talk. She conducted interviews in community centers and churches, worked with advocacy groups, spoke Spanish and Haitian Creole. She never pushed, just listened, and promised to ensure this never happened again. Slowly, she built a list of 17 victims willing to testify. 17 people describing checkpoint detentions stretching hours, threats of family separation, cash demands to resolve unexplained violations. The case file grew to 3 banker's boxes of meticulous documentation. Every transaction documented, every interview transcribed, every checkpoint report cross-referenced. The kind of investigation that took months to build but would take years to dismantle, and even then would fail because the evidence was overwhelming. Now Martina sat in a grand jury room presenting her findings to 23 citizens. She walked them through spreadsheets and bank records, showing checkpoint detentions on one side, cash deposits on the other, connected by lines showing money flowing from vulnerable immigrants to McDaniels' accounts with machine-like regularity. What you're seeing, she explained, is a pattern repeating 37 times over 24 months. She detailed how victims were told their documentation had irregularities, threatened with deportation, then given an option: pay a fine and the problem disappears. She showed them Rosa Delgado's photograph. 71 years old, legal permanent resident for 38 years, detained 4 hours, told her green card was fraudulent, paid $5,000, 3 from savings meant for her granddaughter's college, 2 borrowed from her church. The jury deliberated 37 minutes. They returned a true bill on all charges: extortion, wire fraud, money laundering, civil rights deprivation, assault. Martina left the courthouse as sun painted the Federal Plaza gold. She had another case waiting, another buried complaint, another potential pattern. The work never stopped. But tonight, she allowed herself satisfaction. Curtis McDaniels would face justice. His victims would have their day. And the message was clear. Someone was watching, patient and thorough, building cases so airtight that even the best lawyer couldn't find cracks. The morning of the trial, Terrell stood before the mirror, considering the uniform he hadn't worn in 3 years. The Marine Corps dress blues with their midnight blue coat, red trim, gleaming buttons. And on the shoulders, the 2 silver stars marking a rank achieved by less than 1% of everyone who'd ever worn the uniform. His mother had settled the question 3 days ago. You think your Marines would want you to let this man walk away because you're too proud to put on your uniform? You wore it to protect people. This man terrorized me, and God knows how many others. You put that uniform on and show those jurors exactly who Curtis McDaniels thought he could push around. So Terrell dressed with automatic precision. Trousers with blood stripe. Shirt with precisely knotted tie. Blue coat with ribbons telling the story of 30 years. Combat deployments. The Bronze Star with V device for valor. The Defense Superior Service Medal. The Navy Distinguished Service Medal. The stars went on last. The federal courthouse was already crowded. When Terrell emerged from the car in full dress blues, the crowd went silent, then erupted. Cameras flashed. An older man in a Vietnam veteran's cap snapped to attention and saluted. Terrell returned it automatically. Inside, people moved aside as he passed. 2 Marines in service dress snapped to attention. A federal marshal gave a subtle nod of respect. When Terrell entered the courtroom, every seat was filled. Curtis McDaniels sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit. When he saw Terrell in dress blues, his face went pale. Whatever narrative they'd planned shattered instantly. The jury filed in, eyes immediately locking on Terrell. The uniform transformed everything, from disabled man defends himself to decorated general assaulted by corrupt agent. Commander Moffett called him to the stand. The United States calls Major General Terrell Isaiah O'Connell retired. The courtroom rose automatically as Terrell walked to the witness stand. He took the oath and settled in, looking directly at the jury. Moffett established his service record: 30 years, 3 tours Afghanistan, 2 Iraq, command of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Brigade, advisor to Joint Chiefs, multiple decorations for valor. General, what were you wearing to the immigration hearing? Charcoal suit, business attire. Were you displaying any military insignia or rank? No. McDaniels had no way of knowing who he was dealing with. Just another disabled man with a walking stick. Terrell described the hallway confrontation, the hearing, McDaniels' escalating aggression. When he grabbed my walking stick, he was attempting to physically dominate me. Given the power differential he believed existed, a federal agent confronting a disabled civilian, he expected easy compliance. I defended myself using minimum necessary force to neutralize the threat. Why didn't you identify yourself as a general from the beginning? Because I wasn't there as a general. I was there as a son, helping his mother. The uniform represents 30 years of Marines who served under my command. I don't use it casually. I only put it on today because the prosecutor convinced me it was necessary to show who Agent McDaniels thought he could victimize. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Every question made his client look worse. Other witnesses followed: Martina Coakley with devastating precision, Rosa Delgado, and 3 other victims describing similar experiences. The jury deliberated 3 hours, guilty on all 17 counts. As marshals led McDaniels away, he stopped and looked at Terrell. You could have just paid. None of this had to happen. Terrell stood slowly. You're right. You didn't have to terrorize vulnerable people. You didn't have to assault me. You made choices, bad ones. Now you live with the consequences. Outside, the sun painted the plaza gold. Terrell and Gladys walked through a crowd of respect and gratitude, the walking stick clicking its rhythm. The uniform would go back in the closet. The general could retire again. But the lesson remained. Authority without accountability is tyranny with paperwork. And somewhere, always, people will stand up and fight back. 6 weeks passed. The case had opened floodgates. Within 3 weeks, investigators documented 43 additional cases fitting McDaniel's pattern. Congressional committees announced hearings. The ICE director promised reforms. Through it all, Gladys maintained her routine. But one evening, over dinner, she said, "I want to apply for citizenship." "Mom, you don't need to." "I know I don't need to. But after being treated like I didn't belong, like my documents weren't good enough, I want to be able to say, this is my country without any qualification. I want what that man tried to take from me, the absolute certainty that I belong here." The naturalization ceremony was scheduled the same week as McDaniel's sentencing. Gladys insisted on attending both. The sentencing hearing filled the same courtroom, packed with victims rather than journalists. McDaniels entered looking diminished, weight lost, suit hanging loose, face gray and hollowed. Judge Trudeau heard victim impact statements. Rosa Delgado spoke first, voice shaking. "You took money I saved for my granddaughter's college, $3,000. I had to borrow more from my church. You took my peace." 3 more victims followed, each describing lives disrupted, savings depleted, security shattered. McDaniels gave a halting apology. "I understand now. I abused my position. I hurt vulnerable people. I was a coward who targeted people who couldn't fight back. I'm sorry." Judge Trudeau reviewed her notes, then looked up. "You were given extraordinary authority and turned it into a personal profit center. You preyed on vulnerable people systematically for years. Your apology rings hollow because you didn't stop out of conscience. You stopped because you got caught." She imposed sentence, 108 months in federal prison, 3 years supervised release, $237,000 restitution to victims. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Marshals led McDaniels away. As he passed Gladys, she met his eyes with steady certainty that justice had finally arrived. That afternoon, Terrell drove his mother to the naturalization ceremony. 47 people from 23 countries sat in rows, dressed in their best, holding small American flags. They recited the Oath of Allegiance together, 47 voices in accents from across the globe. Gladys's voice was clear and steady, claiming what was rightfully hers. "By the power vested in me, I declare you are now citizens of the United States of America." The hall erupted in applause and tears. Gladys turned to Terrell, eyes bright. "I've been home for 43 years, but this feels like I can finally stop looking over my shoulder." That evening, Gladys hung her naturalization certificate on the living room wall next to Terrell's military commendations. It looked right there. It looked like it belonged. Terrell's phone buzzed with a text from Moffat. DOJ opening 6 additional investigations based on patterns similar to McDaniel's. Your case is having ripple effects. Terrell typed back, "Thank my mother. She refused to be intimidated." Justice wasn't perfect. McDaniel's had operated for years before being caught. The investigation took 18 months. Somewhere, other corrupt officials still operated, but justice had been served. The corrupt official was imprisoned. Victims received validation. Reforms were being discussed. And, most importantly, a 72-year-old woman who refused to sign papers she didn't understand, who hired a lawyer when told to comply, who stood up for herself against federal authority. She had sparked everything that followed. The walking stick leaned against Terrell's desk, catching lamplight. Some people saw it as weakness. McDaniel's had. He'd been catastrophically wrong. Tomorrow, it would help Terrell walk to physical therapy. Next week, to the Veterans Center. Next month, to his mother's citizenship celebration. It was just a walking stick. But like everything else in this story, a green card, a badge, a uniform, a courtroom, it meant whatever the person using it chose to make it mean. Together, they'd created something that mattered. Not just a conviction, but proof the system could still function, could still protect people, could still deliver justice. And really, what more could you ask for?